Some claim that Satanism, the philosophy of Anton LaVey, is just the philosophy of Ayn Rand with the addition of ritual. People who make this claim have seemingly never read a full book from either author. The differences between Satanism and Ayn Rand's Objectivism today on Satansplain.
Well, it's not Satan worship, it's Satanism. It's embracing the life-enriching things which have traditionally been given the devil's name. Pride, lust, earthly success, rational self-interest, atheism, humor, nonconformity, science, a passion for living, being selective about whom we love. We don't see these as shameful sins, but empowering ideals. And we also recognize the psychological power and fun of symbolism and aesthetics, so we utilize Satan as mythology's most fitting mascot for what we're about.
Satansplain, Satanic Talk with Church of Satan Magister Bill M.
Magister Bill M. here with another episode of Satansplain. I would like to take a moment right now to thank everybody so far who has subscribed to the show in one way or another. Give a like here or a share there. The official website for the show is Satansplain.com. You can also find us on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. All of the links for all of these things can be found on the main site, Satansplain.com. And if you have hung around the internet long enough reading and talking about Satanism, I'm sure you've seen some people trying to compare Anton LaVey to Ayn Rand. Namely, compare Satanism, the philosophy codified by Anton LaVey, with Objectivism, the philosophy codified by Ayn Rand. So in this episode, we're going to Satansplain three things. One, we're going to give a brief overview of who Rand was, what she believed, and what her philosophy is about. Two, we're going to address a fake quotation that's been floating around the internet that gets attributed to Anton LaVey. And third, we're going to get into the glaring fundamental differences between Satanism, as first codified and explained by Anton LaVey, and Objectivism, the philosophy codified by Ayn Rand, particularly through two essays written by two different but prominent Satanists in the Church of Satan. Now, some of you may be thinking, Bill, that's going to be a lot of information, and I don't have the patience to hear this whole episode. You know, I have, like ADHD. Can you give me a soundbite answer? Okay. Satanism is philosophically not the same thing as Objectivism. Anton LaVey did not say that Satanism is nothing more than Rand's Objectivism plus ritual. They're similar insofar as they both take a skeptical worldview and also place the individual over the collective, but that's about it. If you want to see how greatly they differ, just look at Satanic Statements numbers 7 and 8. I suppose I could just end the episode here, but I'm not going to, because this is a topic that demands a more thorough Satansplaining. If this were a scientific paper, well, what I just said, you can consider the abstract of the paper. So now that that's out of the way, let's dig in. Specifically, let's start with an overview of who Rand was and what her philosophy was all about. Ayn Rand, her first name is A-Y-N, Ayn. I've heard it pronounced a few different ways, but I'm going with Ayn, because it's Ayn and not Anne. And her last name, Rand, R-A-N-D. Rand was a philosopher and a novelist. She was born in Russia in 1905. She was 12 years old when the Bolshevik Revolution happened. Russia fell to communism, and she saw her family suffer under it. But by the age of 20, she was able to come to the United States under a work visa. She did some work as a screenwriter. One of her biggest novels was in 1943. That was called The Fountainhead, and it was in 1957 that she published her best-known novel, Atlas Shrugged. Those two books are particularly significant because the protagonists in those books have a certain philosophical mindset, and Rand took that philosophy, expanded it, and developed it into what became known as Objectivism. Rand died in 1982 at the age of 77, but there are many Objectivists today. Those are the people who follow her philosophy of Objectivism. There's also the Atlas Society, which preserves her works and lectures on the topic of Objectivism. Now, Ayn Rand was controversial in her time and is still controversial today. I see a lot of people these days who've jumped on this bandwagon of saying they hate Rand. Most of them, it seems, haven't really read any of her works for themselves and are just parroting accusations that they've heard from other people. There have also been lots of people making comparisons of Rand's philosophy to those of Anton LaVey and using that as some sort of attempt to discredit LaVey, or at the very least grossly misrepresent what Satanism is really all about. On a side note, you would think, if anything, they would use that comparison to discredit Rand, relating Rand to the Church of Satan, and yet it's the other way around that we see with these trolls online. So anyway, what was it that Rand actually believed? What is this philosophy she called Objectivism? We could spend a whole episode talking about it, but I think the best summary of Objectivism came from this little excerpt that Rand herself wrote in 1962. And I'm going to paraphrase most of this, but you can look up the full writing online if you like. There's a challenge that sometimes gets put to people, and that is, can you explain your position while standing on one foot? So in other words, can you explain your philosophy or explain what your argument on this issue is in a reasonably short time? Sometimes this is also called giving the elevator pitch, because the idea is you're on an elevator with some top executive, you want to impress that person, and you have only the duration of the elevator ride, or he can't get away, and you have to sell him the idea. I mean, that's the thing you hear in the introduction of Satansplain. I had the challenge a few years back of explaining Satanism in under half a minute, and that was my answer. So, getting back to Rand, somebody working for her book publisher asked Rand, back in the day, to present the essence of her philosophy, Objectivism, while standing on one foot. And this was her answer. Metaphysics, objective reality. Epistemology, reason. Ethics, self-interest. And politics, capitalism. Now, expanding on each of those points, what did she mean? Point 1, Objectivism's metaphysics is objective reality. She says this means nature commands. We have no choice but to obey nature. Wishing for something won't make it so. Reality exists as an objective absolute. Facts are facts, independent of human feelings, wishes, hopes, or fears. Point 2, reason. She says reason, defined here as the faculty which identifies and integrates the material provided by human senses, is the human's only means of perceiving reality. Our only source of knowledge, our only guide to action, and the basic means of survival. 3.3, the ethics of self-interest. Every individual person is an end in himself or herself, not the means to the ends of others. For example, your life's purpose is not to serve a god. You exist to serve yourself, not to sacrifice yourself to others, or have others sacrifice themselves to you. The pursuit of your own rational self-interest and your own happiness is itself the highest moral purpose of this life, for you as a human. And finally, point number 4, the politics of capitalism. She says the ideal political economic system is laissez-faire capitalism. People deal with one another through free trade, voluntary exchange for mutual benefit. You don't get something from somebody else by force. The government's role is to protect human rights using force against those who would restrict it, but not for the government to use force to take away your rights. There should be a complete separation of state and economics, just as there should be a separation of church and state. So that is Objectivism in a nutshell, and here's the big question. Is that Satanism? Is that the same thing we see in the Satanic Bible? When you disregard for a moment the pentagrams, the Hail Satans, the black candles, and just look at the philosophy, which is outlined in particular in the Satanic Bible in the Book of Lucifer. I mean, I would argue that the ritual aspect is not wholly separate from the Satanic philosophy, but it is in fact a logical extension of it and an integral part of it, but that's a topic for a whole nother Satansplain episode. But the answer is no, they are not the same. Objectivism and Satanism are not the same. There is most certainly some overlap between the two. And when I read you those things, if you're a Satanist, I'm sure you agreed with some of what I read in that description of Objectivism. Both Satanism and Objectivism take more or less a skeptical, atheist, materialistic worldview. Both Satanism and Objectivism are about putting the individual first, valuing the individual practitioner above the collective. So those are two ideas which you find in both Satanism and Objectivism, and which distinguish themselves from most other religions and most of the other philosophies out there. But aside from those two things, I would say that's really it. And when I see online trolls claim, oh, Anton LaVey's Satanism is just Ayn Rand plus black candles, I ask them, okay, besides skeptical atheism and rational self-interest, what other commonalities do you see between the two? And I never get an answer. And no, you can't say that skeptical atheism and rational self-interest are the totality of satanic philosophy. Otherwise, the Satanic Bible would be about 10 pages long. What's even stranger, though, is I'll get some people who say, well, I'm a Satanist, but I reject LaVey because it's too much like Ayn Rand. And again, these people typically have never read the Satanic Bible in full, let alone any single book from Ayn Rand. And they can never tell me what the two have in common besides those two things, skeptical atheism and rational self-interest. Though I would say more importantly, I have to wonder, if you disagree with those two ideas, then why are you even calling yourself a Satanist in the first place? Do you believe in supernatural deities? Do you believe in sacrificing the individual for the collective? If so, sorry, you're not really a Satanist. You need to reevaluate your choice of religion. Now, later in this episode, we're going to get down into the details of where the philosophies of LaVey and Rand hugely differ, and I mean on a fundamental level. But just to point to an example right off the bat, I mentioned earlier that Rand embraces laissez-faire capitalism as a political and economics model, and personally, I do too, but there are other Satanists who do not. There are objectivists who would read things like our points of Pentagonal revisionism and see points like strict taxation of all churches or lex talionis and say, well, this certainly isn't what objectivism is about. And this is why the Church of Satan, by the way, does not have an official position on politics or economics. That's because Satanism does not have an official position on politics or economics. Satanism isn't a religion for the population at large. It is Satanism. We don't have plans and proposals on how to make the entire world a better place. Satanism is about the individual. We are selfishly in this game of life for ourselves. What politics or economic plan best benefits that? Well, the answer to that will depend on the individual Satanist. You vote or advocate for what you feel is in your own selfish interest. Satanists come from all sorts of socio-economic classes and geographical regions and ages and family units, so our answers are not going to be the same when it comes to politics or economics. Some Satanists find that voting for candidate A is in their best interest. Some Satanists find that voting for candidate B is in their best interest. Some Satanists think voting is a complete waste of time. Some Satanists don't live in a country where they can vote in the first place. But let's get back to these parts where Satanism and objectivism do overlap. Is there any truth to the accusation that Anton LaVey stole his ideas from Ayn Rand? I would say no, and here's why. LaVey was very public and upfront about his influences. There was a dedication page in the first editions of the Satanic Bible, which the publisher later removed, but it did list various people Anton LaVey credited as an influence. We have video documentaries of LaVey talking about who and what influenced him and led to the development of Satanism. Written biographies, LaVey talking about his influences as well, and honestly, I have not seen Rand come up in those lists. If she was a big influence on LaVey, as big of an influence as some people claim she was, then you would think he would mention her in some of these places, but he doesn't. Personally, I suspect that the similarities between Satanism and objectivism, and again, it's just those two things as far as I know, so it's hardly as big as some people try to make the similarities out to be. I think those came from influences common to both LaVey and Rand. We do, for example, have records of both LaVey and Rand crediting Nietzsche as an influence. In his works, we find philosophies about the individual and the Uberman and so on, so that seems like a much more plausible explanation for the similarities between Satanism and objectivism. Not that objectivism influenced Satanism directly, but both of them had some common influences. But I think there's an even more important point to be made here. People who bring up the comparison of LaVey and Rand in the first place always seem to do so as some attempt to discredit LaVey, as I said earlier. I mentioned the earlier example of people who already hate Rand, already assume that everybody else feels the same way, and say they're a Satanist but reject LaVey for the Rand similarities, which again makes no sense because the similarities are only two things. More importantly, two things which, if you were to reject them, it would beg the question of why would you call yourself a Satanist in the first place, or where you're getting your definition of Satanism from. So that's one reason I've seen people try to bring up the comparison. Another reason is that I've noticed this trend where people make no distinction between influences and plagiarism, and they get gleeful when they find out that somebody they're jealous of had borrowed some idea or another, thinking that this discredits any and all originality. Well, the painful truth is that there is no such thing as a 100% original philosopher. Every philosopher, every religion's creator, was influenced by people prior to themselves. That's how philosophies and religions are formed. Somebody studies a bunch of different views and has their own set of personal experiences and observations. Then they take parts that they feel make the most sense or seem the most true. They put them together, and that's how we get a new religion or new philosophy. Anton LaVey did not steal from his sources any more than any other philosopher in history had stolen from his own influences. And don't even give me that fucking line of, Anton LaVey plagiarized, might is right. No. He took a book that was already in the public domain, a book that people in the 21st century probably would never even know of today if it weren't for Anton LaVey. He credits the author on the dedication page of the Satanic Bible. He wrote an introduction to a reprinting of Might is Right. In short, you'd have to be incredibly stupid to think that LaVey went about his life trying to pass off the words as all his own. Now, there's a quotation that gets passed around a lot online. It's attributed to Anton LaVey. The claim is that he said, quote, "Oh, it's just Ayn Rand plus ritual." Did he actually say this? Well, just because you found a JPEG online of the words pasted over his image doesn't mean it's authentic. And if you automatically believed it without question, you're not very smart. Not very satanically minded. We'll talk more about this and get into more dirty details of where Satanism and Objectivism differ right after this quick commercial break. You are listening to Satansplain.
In 1966, Anton LaVey created the Church of Satan, marking the beginning of the Age of Fire and Year 1 Anno Satanas. In 1969, he published the Satanic Bible, codifying Satanism as a religion, the first time it's been done in human history.
In the name of Satan, ruler of the earth, king of hell, come forth from the pit, bestow the blessings of hell upon us. For we are your children, and we invoke thee this night.
In 2001, I was appointed High Priest of the Church of Satan. In 2007, I published the Satanic Scriptures, further defining and expanding on Satanic philosophy and greater magic ritual.
Hail, Satan full of might! Hail, Satan full of might! Our allegiance is with thee! Our allegiance is with thee! Cursed are they! Cursed are they! The God adorers! The God adorers! And cursed are the worshippers! And cursed are the worshippers! Of the Nazarene eunuch! Of the Nazarene eunuch!
For the past 50 years, the Church of Satan has stood as the sole organization to define and defend Satanism as a religion. And though pretenders to the infernal throne have come and gone, we have stood the test of time and will into the future. Visit churchofsatan.com for more information and read the Satanic Bible and the Satanic Scriptures. Knowledge is the solution for ignorance. Hail, Satan!
Hail, Satan! Hail, Satan!
You are listening to Satansplain, real satanic talk with Church of Satan Magister Bill M. For questions, comments, and correspondence, send an email to bill@satansplain.com. Satanism.com.
Magister Bill M. here with Satansplain. Before the break, we talked about a quotation that gets passed around a lot online, where LaVey is reported to have said that this thing he put together called Satanism is just Ayn Rand plus ritual. I've seen some idiots use this unsourced internet quote as an example of what the Church of Satan believes politically. I've already explained why that's completely wrong. Never mind the fact that Objectivism doesn't just have political positions. It has a philosophy too, and it seems obvious to me that this is what the quote is referring to. Now, did LaVey claim this about Satanism? The short answer is no, at least not quite. So where does this quote come from? Well, I've talked to various Church of Satan members, and as far as we can tell, it's a corruption of a quote from a witchcraft article from the Washington Post, written all the way back in 1970. Talk about a desperate dig into the past, but I digress. The article is about the general rise in interest at that time of witchcraft and the occult, so they interview notable witchcraft authors of that time like Ray Buckland and Sybil Leek. They also interview Anton LaVey. I'm going to read you 2 paragraphs from that article which will give you the full context of the quote. With a showman's instinct, he played the devil in Rosemary's Baby. Anton LaVey had painted the interior of his church hellish red and black, conducts his services by the light of black candles, and uses a naked female Satanist as a quote-unquote living altar. Quote, "The go-go girls we originally asked became too scared," unquote, he explains. Basically, however, the satanic high priest believes he is ritualizing a philosophy. Quote, "I give them Ayn Rand with trappings," unquote, he says. Satanism is a form of controlled self-interest, declares the Satanic Bible. It is in the nature of man to be a selfish pleasure seeker, and no guilt should be felt on this account. Fortified by LaVey's incantations for conjuring up lust, destruction, or compassion as the need arises, his disciples go forth into the world to win their heart's desire. And that is the end of the 2 paragraphs that I selected from the article. So that is the full context of the quote. The article goes on from there to describe the activities of the Church of Satan at the time, but again, what I read you is the only place Rand is mentioned at all. And that's the full context of the quote. First they quote LaVey making a remark about hired go-go girls. Then the article's author tries summarizing what Satanism is about. And in between, he quotes LaVey as saying, quote, "I give them Ayn Rand with trappings," unquote. Do we know the full conversation of where the line showed up? No. Was LaVey perhaps asked by the reporter, "So this idea of the virtue of selfishness sounds like Ayn Rand, but what is it that you offer which Objectivism doesn't?" Maybe he asked that. We don't know. Did LaVey go on to list the differences between Satanism and Objectivism? We don't know. Was he just trying to give an oversimplified line to shut up a journalist? Maybe. We don't know. All we have is this one isolated quote that the author uses, sandwiched in between descriptions that definitely match Objectivism in some ways, but also definitely don't in others. So that is where, as far as I can tell, the quote is derived from. And again, LaVey doesn't say, "Oh, my thing is just Ayn Rand plus ritual." He says, quote, "I give them Ayn Rand with trappings." Aside from this one article from 1970, I don't think I've seen him mention or bring up Rand. And again, maybe the interviewer was the one who brought up Rand in the first place. We're not given much to go on here. The article itself, again, is about the rise of witchcraft in general. So maybe LaVey was asked how Satanism differs from Wicca and the different witchcraft groups popping up around this time. I suppose I could kind of see the description of Ayn Rand plus trappings that might give somebody the gist of what Satanism is about. But it's sort of like trying to describe the Day of the Dead festival as, "Oh, it's just a Mexican Halloween." Or describing Hanukkah as, "Oh, it's just Jewish Christmas." Again, like at best, it gives you some kind of gist of what it's about, but it's still a really gross oversimplification. No rabbi is going to tell somebody, "Hanukkah, oh, it's just the Jewish version of Christmas. That's all you really need to know. Even though the only thing the two have in common is that they're religious holidays that take place in December, they're celebrated in two completely different ways, for two different lengths of time, for two completely different reasons, by two distinctively different religions. No. The two words Jewish Christmas tells you everything you need to know about the 8-day candle miracle and the menorah and the dreidel. Actually, come to think of it, I think a rabbi would say that just to be a wise ass and point out how stupid the description is. But you get my point. It is just as short-sighted and ignorant to think that you can give the totality of Satanism as, quote, Rand plus ritual, or Rand plus trappings. Again, if LaVey thought that that was the totality of Satanism, he wouldn't have written all he had written or cited all of his actual influences. Which brings us to the final part of this episode. Where exactly do Satanism and Objectivism differ, and differ in no small way? To answer this question, I'm just going to quote two particular essays I know of on the topic. These are both written by Church of Satan Hierarchy. The first of these is an article by Magister Nemo. The second article is from Magister Michael Rose. Magister Nemo's essay is simply called Satanism and Objectivism, and you can find it on the official Church of Satan website, churchofsatan.com. But instead of reading it in full, I'm just going to give you a summary. Nemo's article was originally published back in 1997, which again just shows how long we've been having to explain this to people. Then again, I suppose if somebody doesn't have the intellectual capacity to read an article, they don't have it to read an actual work of LaVey or Rand and see how they differ. But at the beginning of this article, Nemo explains that he is quite a strong admirer of Ayn Rand, but I am an even stronger admirer of Anton LaVey, he says, precisely for the vital differences between the philosophies of Objectivism and Satanism. And then he goes on to point out 4 particular differences between the two. First, he points out that Objectivism holds that metaphysics, that branch of philosophy which concerns itself with the nature of reality, determines the nature of epistemology, which is the question of how humans obtain knowledge, and ethics, and politics, and art. Nemo points out that this is sort of an unsettled debate among philosophers, but more importantly, Satanism does not outright assert that reality is totally objective. We do say that there's the carnal and not the spiritual. We certainly condemn things like self-deceit and solipsism and mysticism too. And you can be a Satanist who holds the view that reality is totally objective, but Satanism doesn't automatically dismiss subjective experiences as being invalid. Discussions on epistemology and other philosophical stuff can get fuzzy and messy pretty fast, so I'm just going to leave that point as is and move on, tying that first observation into Nemo's second point, which is, quote, Satanism does not hold that a life appropriate to a rational being is the sole standard of ethical right, as does Objectivism. If anything, Satanism holds that indulgence in life or fun, as perceived by the individual, is the highest standard of ethics. Nemo goes on to elaborate on this point, but to drive this point across, I'm just going to give a perfectly blunt example of this rationality versus indulgence point. And I would say consider sexual fetishes. Are sexual fetishes rational? No. If you're somebody who is turned on by, I don't know, say midget porn, there's no rational reason why a person would be sexually turned on by somebody being a midget or somebody in leather or somebody smoking or whatever other fetish you can think of. In fact, if there were an objective explanation for it, then by definition it wouldn't be a sexual fetish. But if that's what turns you on and you can indulge in it with consensual adult partners, then Satanism says go right ahead and do it. If you get an orgasm out of it, then who cares whether or not people find it rational? Conversely, I'm not into the stuff I listed, but if you are, what the hell do I care? What on earth would I have to gain by telling somebody, now, you know, you're not being a rational atheist because there is no rational reason for you to be turned on by this porn that you use? Your correct response to me would be, fuck off. And we got sidetracked talking about porn. Where were we? Ah, yes. The third difference Nemo lists between Satanism and Objectivism. When it comes to the topic of self-sacrifice, there is a difference here. Both philosophies would agree that self-sacrifice is in general a bad thing, at the very least, not a virtuous thing. There's an oath that shows up in one of the characters from Ayn Rand's novel Atlas Shrugged. And the oath is, quote, "I swear by my life and my love of it that I will never live for the sake of another man, nor ask another man to live for mine." Now, the first half of that we're in agreement with. It's unsatanic to sacrifice your life for something outside of yourself. This doesn't mean you never do things for anybody else. This is all explained in the Satanic Bible on the chapter of psychic vampires, so I'm not going to Satansplain it all to you now. It's one thing to carry out the responsibilities you have, honor social contracts and all that stuff, but quite another to dedicate your life to pleasing some external entity, whether that's a mythical deity or a bully or a political cause or whatever. But let's look at the second half of that oath, nor ask another man to live for mine. Objectivism is saying that forcing anybody to submit to the will of the strong is ethically wrong, but as a Satanist, I would say that depends. If somebody is just a masochist and sincerely gets some kind of validation out of serving somebody, I'm not necessarily going to go out of my way to call that immoral or stop it. If somebody wants to make a big sacrifice to me, like stupidly giving me $1,000 for no reason, well, I'm not necessarily going to stop them either. If I benefit from somebody else's stupidity and self-sacrifice, I can just take that as a win and move on. And finally, point number 4, objectivism completely rejects the notion of God in their metaphysics, which Satanists are in agreement with, except in 2 important areas. First of all, we think calling ourselves our own gods is a useful metaphor to describe how we see ourselves. I am my own God. I am the most important person in my life. I'm the one who bears the biggest burden of responsibility for how that life goes. The second difference that Nemo points out is that in the role of satanic ritual, you could say that the Satanist is ascribing godlike qualities to himself or herself. It's known that this is a pure fantasy role, but again, Satanists are taking these notions of things like God and ceremony from religion and not taking them literally, but not throwing them completely away either. So to sum it up, Satanism and objectivism take some philosophically different stances on things like objective truth and rationality, not because Satanism believes in the supernatural, we don't, but we realize that subjective experiences and fantasy have an important role to play if you play them right. We also don't really heap any kind of immoral shame or crusade on non-Satanist humans who might choose to self-sacrifice, especially if it benefits us. And finally, we don't completely throw away the notion of God or religion. We repurpose all of that and make it work for us, just metaphorically. Now, these 4 examples, I would say, are different enough on a fundamental level to make Satanism and objectivism 2 different philosophies. Again, there's certainly some overlap, and there are many Satanists who love the writings of Rand, both fiction and nonfiction, myself included. I would even call Atlas Shrugged a satanic novel in many ways, but this claim of one being the same as the other philosophically, that just doesn't hold. So that was an overview of Magister Nemo's essay, but I would like to now close the episode out by reading the second essay I mentioned from Magister Michael Rose. This essay shows up in his book Infernalia, his compilation book of essays. You can buy Infernalia from underworldamusements.com. Lots of other great titles there as well. I wanted to get a hold of Magister Rose. It had been quite a while since I spoke with him or spent any time in person with him. Unfortunately, I no longer had his contact info, so I went directly to Underworld Amusements to ask for permission for me to read his essay in its entirety, and they said, okay. So here we go. Objections to Objectivism from Magister Michael Rose. I have come across many references citing Ayn Rand as a satanic writer. Granted, most of those who do this are Christian propagandists who cannot be taken seriously, but others who are more well-disposed towards Satanism have done the same. While there are positive and useful things to be found in Miss Rand's books, I do not see how Objectivism, Ayn Rand's philosophy, can be equated with Satanism. Objectivism and Satanism differ in many ways. Objectivism approaches humanity with general goodwill. Satanism recognizes that humanity is generally unworthy of our goodwill. Objectivism buys into the freedom and natural rights drivel contained in the Declaration of Independence. The Satanist knows that quote-unquote natural rights are not natural and that only the responsible few deserve freedom. The Objectivist sees man as something separate and apart from nature, a thinker, not a beast. The Satanist knows that man is a thinking beast bound up inextricably in the natural world. The Objectivist believes that time is strictly linear, progressing forward. The Satanist recognizes the, quote, cycling of the ages of time. The Objectivist expresses belief in equality, despite Rand's recognition of the stratification inherent in nature. The Satanist dispenses with all such lip service to egalitarian notions. I also have aesthetic differences with Rand, particularly in regard to architecture, which ordinarily I wouldn't give much consideration to, but since Rand is so dogmatic about it, I will go into it. To Rand, the pinnacle of architectural achievement is the skyscraper. All other forms of architecture are insignificant. The neoclassical style she is particularly contemptuous of. Admirers of these architectural styles are anathema to Rand. Personally, I find skyscrapers to be, for the most part, hideous. Not surprisingly, Rand agrees with the popular assessment of so-called totalitarian architecture. Had Hitler built tall glass and steel boxes, she would sing a different tune, but since he preferred the Gothic and neoclassical, it is only natural that she rejects it. Like many others, Rand argues that such monumentality is designed to make man feel small and insignificant. I don't see it that way myself. As I see it, only the small and insignificant could be so intimidated by a building. Could it be that small and insignificant people cannot maintain their delusions of grandeur in the face of such true grandeur? It is easy for me to see how the masses could find inspiration in the sterile and monotonous uniformity of the modern skyscraper. Despite their atheism, the Objectivists seem to adhere to the Christian concept that the earth exists solely for one purpose, to provide raw materials for man's progress. Considering its foundations in English Enlightenment-era philosophy, it is hardly surprising that certain remnants of Christian thought, albeit rationalized Christian ideas, have been incorporated into Objectivist philosophy. The Objectivists agree that with John Locke that land left in its natural state is land gone to waste. An Objectivist utopia would be a skyscraper-filled, coast-to-coast urban sprawl. Of course, the mountains and forests would have to go, but think of the raw materials they'd yield up. Rand would presume to take upon herself and her philosophy the mantle of romanticism. I just don't see it. The Romantics and the Objectivists are worlds apart. The sense of tragedy and alienation so prevalent in the writings of the Romantics is entirely alien to Objectivism. The following quote from Peter Thorslev's book, The Byronic Hero, while referring to the poets and writers of the Enlightenment, can be applied to the Objectivists as well. Quote, Dryden, Swift, Pope, or Samuel Johnson were severe critics of the society in which they lived, to be sure, but they were always critics from within that society. They never at any time considered that they had some inner vision of truth not visible to the common readers of their age. They were quite convinced that all men could see as they did if they but looked at nature in the light of their common reason and common sense. Unquote. While there are analogies between Romanticism and Satanism, the Objectivists correspond more closely to these predecessors of the Romantics. Rand at times went on about the Greeks as a model for Western culture. What she meant by Greek culture was limited to classical sculpture and the philosophy of Aristotle. Everything else must go. She accepts only the Apollonian aspects of Greek culture, rejecting out of hand the Dionysian elements of the culture. While she spoke approvingly of Greek art, she has no use for Greek drama since she saw tragedy as demeaning to man. Central to Objectivism is the exaltation of reason and objectivity. It is because of this that Objectivism rejects categorically the Dionysian aspects of Greek culture. I find this pretense of objectivity to be one of the most annoying things about Objectivism. Certainly no one can deny that the world is full of objective facts. What is equally undeniable is that before these objective facts can be internalized by an individual, they must be interpreted. Raw data is ultimately useless. This interpretation is always subjective because it is based on individual experiences and biases. While subjectivity can be carried to extremes, to pretend at objectivity is no better. Objectivism is, in the final analysis, an imbalanced dualistic system. Like all such dualistic philosophies, they reduce everything to simplistic black and white choices. In the world of the objectivists, there are no shades of gray. They would do well to learn the lesson Nietzsche taught in The Birth of Tragedy, that it is the tension between the Apollonian and Dionysian drives that creates a vital society. Without this balance, societies will drift towards either a morass of subjectivity and uncontrolled passions or a sterile, hyper-rational Apollonian nightmare. Unlike the Apollonian objectivist, the Satanist recognizes the necessity of this balance in nature. And that concludes the essay Objections to Objectivism by Magister Michael Rose, one of many excellent essays in his book Infernalia, available through underworldamusements.com. If you don't have it, go there and buy a copy today, underworldamusements.com. And finally, to throw in my own observation that I mentioned at the very beginning of the episode, if you want a quick explanation that debunks the argument that Satanism is just Ayn Rand's objectivism plus ritual, Satanic Statements numbers 7 and 8. The 9 Satanic Statements are fundamental parts of Satanism, and 2, in particular, statements number 7 and 8, I would say go against Ayn Rand's objectivism. Number 7, about man being an animal. Objectivism, it seems, does what practically all other religions do, and that is considers it virtuous for man to behave less like an animal and more like a human. That there's something enlightening about eschewing certain primal behaviors. Satanism, of course, says the opposite. And statement number 8, Satanism representing all of the so-called sins, namely the 7 deadly sins. Ask an objectivist what he or she thinks about envy. They will tell you envy is bad. In Satanism, envy is good. You see what other people have. You want it for yourself, so it drives you to make your own or otherwise obtain it for yourself. Not stealing what is already somebody else's, but having your own too. Envy can be inspiring like that. And we'll stop here for today. Thank you for listening. If you run across idiots online parroting this claim that Satanism is just Rand's objectivism plus ritual, or think that that's all LaVey said Satanism was, or try to use that as a way to reject Satanism while embracing some completely different set of beliefs erroneously labeled as Satanism, well, feel free to share this clip of Satansplain to them. Visit the official website for Satansplain, which is at satansplain.com. Email me your questions and comments if you like, bill@satansplain.com. That is the email address. And again, please go to underworldamusements.com and buy Infernalia by Magister Michael Rose, if you don't own it already. Thanks for listening. Hail Satan. You have been listening to Satansplain. If you have enjoyed this episode, please give it a like and subscribe where available. For more information on the show, visit satansplain.com. And to learn more about Satanism itself, visit churchofsatan.com. This episode, copyright 2022, Magister Bill M.